In the winter of 2009, a small community in Illinois found itself at the center of a tragedy that would ignite debates about justice, psychology, and the reliability of confessions obtained under pressure. What began as a routine day at a suburban daycare facility soon unraveled into a criminal case that still raises uncomfortable questions about interrogation methods, human psychology, and the fine line between truth and suggestion. On a cold January morning, parents dropped off their children as they always did. Among them was a 16-month-old boy, full of life and energy. As the day progressed, there was no indication that anything unusual would occur. The staff went about their tasks, organizing activities, tending to the children, and preparing for the long hours that came with caring for toddlers. By mid-afternoon, however, the ordinary rhythm of the daycare was shattered. The child, who had once been alert and playful, was suddenly unresponsive. Despite frantic attempts at resuscitation and immediate medical intervention, his life could not be saved. Doctors would later determine that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The diagnosis was stark. Forensic analysis suggested an impact of considerable force. And while accidents involving children are not uncommon, the severity of the injury raised suspicions. Investigators began to probe deeper, questioning the staff who had been with the boy during his final hours. Among them was a young daycare worker whose account of the events became the focal point of an extensive and controversial interrogation. At first, her story seemed consistent with what one might expect. She described a moment when the toddler slipped from her grasp and struck his head against the back of a chair. He cried, then seemed fine, crawling to his blanket as though nothing had happened. Minutes later, he collapsed. It sounded like a tragic accident, one of those unpredictable moments that occur even under the most careful supervision. But investigators were not satisfied. To them, the details did not fully explain the severity of the injury. What followed was an interrogation that would later be analyzed in classrooms and documentaries as a textbook example of psychological manipulation. The detectives who questioned her employed a range of tactics, each carefully designed to erode her defenses and guide her toward a version of events that aligned with their suspicions. They began with empathy, presenting themselves as understanding, even sympathetic. They reassured her that accidents happen, that no one was suggesting she was malicious, and that sometimes tragedies occur despite a caregiver's best intentions. This approach was deliberate. By minimizing the perceived severity of the incident, the investigators encouraged her to view confession not as an admission of guilt, but as a pathway to relief. They implied that acknowledging a mistake would not brand her as a criminal, but rather demonstrate honesty and accountability. This was the principle of minimization, a well-documented interrogation strategy in which the seriousness of an act is downplayed to make disclosure more appealing. Alongside minimization came rapport building. The detectives spoke to her about children, about the difficulty of caregiving, and even about their own experiences as parents. They told her they knew she loved the children and that they understood the stresses of dealing with tantrums, exhaustion, and the unpredictability of toddlers. They painted themselves not as adversaries, but as confidants, people who could empathize with her struggles. The subtle message was that they were on her side, that telling them what happened would bring closure not only to the grieving family, but also to her own sense of guilt. Yet beneath this veneer of kindness lay a calculated pressure. The investigators repeated their questions relentlessly. They circled back to the same details again and again, introducing slight variations, pressing her to reconcile inconsistencies, and subtly planting alternative scenarios. Could it have been that she dropped the child accidentally? Could it be that she placed him too firmly into the chair? Could frustration have momentarily clouded her judgment? Each suggestion offered her a ready-made explanation that seemed less damning than outright denial. Repetition plays a powerful role in interrogations. When a person is asked the same question multiple times, they may begin to doubt their own memory. Combined with fatigue, stress, and fear, this can lead to compliance, where the individual begins to accept and internalize the investigator's narrative. In this case, the more the detectives suggested that it might have been a simple mistake, the more plausible that version began to sound. As the hours wore on, the questioning grew sharper. The supportive tone was intermittently replaced with direct challenges. One detective would press with skepticism, pointing out that the injuries could not have occurred as she initially described. The other would then intervene with reassurance, suggesting that it was understandable if she had simply made a mistake. This alternating rhythm, often described as the good cop, bad cop dynamic, created a psychological contrast that made the sympathetic detective appear all the more trustworthy. Another tactic at play was the use of authority. The detectives repeatedly emphasized their experience, asserting that they had seen similar cases countless times. They insisted that science and forensic evidence would ultimately reveal the truth, implying that resistance was futile. By presenting themselves as experts who already knew what happened, they created an atmosphere in which denial seemed both hopeless and dishonest. Under these pressures, her account began to shift. She moved from outright denial to tentative concessions. She acknowledged that the child may have hit his head earlier in the day, perhaps while throwing himself backward during a tantrum. She admitted that he sometimes resisted diaper changes, arching his back and striking his head against the changing table mat. Each of these admissions brought her closer to the narrative the detectives were constructing, even though they did not amount to intentional harm. The critical turning point came when she began to echo their language. She described the child slipping from her hands, hitting the back of the chair, and then sliding to the floor. It was a moment that mirrored almost word for word the scenario they had suggested. What had started as her insistence on innocence had gradually transformed into a partial confession framed as an accident. To the investigators, this was progress. To psychologists who later studied the case, it was a troubling example of how suggestion can reshape memory and perception. False confessions are not merely the stuff of fiction. Research has shown that under certain conditions, especially when suspects are young, inexperienced, or highly suggestible, interrogation tactics can lead them to admit to acts they did not commit. The stress of prolonged questioning, the desire to escape an intolerable situation, and the belief that cooperation will bring leniency all contribute to this phenomenon. In this case, the daycare worker was only 22 years old, with no prior experience of criminal investigations. Alone in a room with seasoned interrogators, she faced an imbalance of power that was almost impossible to overcome. The detectives appealed not only to her sense of responsibility, but also to her fear of future consequences. They warned her that if she did not tell the truth now, it would later appear that she was lying. They suggested that waiting days to clarify her story would strip her of credibility. They invoked the opinion of prosecutors, explaining that cooperation would make her look better in the eyes of the state. They spoke of her reputation, her family, her entire future, painting a bleak picture of what would happen if she continued to deny involvement. Gradually, she began to waver. The line between her own memory and the detective's narrative blurred. She conceded that she may have been responsible, though she did not know how. She admitted feeling guilty and fearful, worrying that perhaps something she had done had caused the tragedy. Finally, she described the child slipping, hitting the chair, and falling to the floor, a version of events that aligned with the interrogation's trajectory. Yet even in this confession, there were contradictions. She insisted she had not slammed the child, that she had not lost her temper, and that she had never intentionally hurt him. The confession was framed entirely in terms of an accident, a momentary lapse of control, a misfortune that could happen to anyone. To the detectives, however, this was enough. It provided a narrative they could present to prosecutors, a story that transformed suspicion into evidence. The case ultimately went to trial, and the confession became a cornerstone of the prosecution's argument. Jurors heard not only the forensic evidence, but also the recorded statements, where the daycare worker described the incident in her own words. The fact that these words had been shaped, guided, and in some ways constructed by the detectives was less apparent in the courtroom than it was to those who later analyzed the tapes. The conviction that followed left many with a sense of unease. Was justice truly served? Or had a vulnerable young woman been manipulated into confessing to a crime she did not commit? The boy's death was undeniably tragic, but the circumstances surrounding it remained clouded by uncertainty. Medical experts could not rule out the possibility of an accidental fall or an underlying condition. The confession itself was riddled with inconsistencies, and yet the outcome was final: a guilty verdict, a prison sentence, a life forever altered. This case highlights the complex interplay between law enforcement, psychology, and justice. On one hand, investigators are tasked with uncovering the truth, often under immense pressure to provide answers to grieving families and anxious communities. On the other, the methods they use can sometimes produce the very distortions they seek to avoid. The reliance on confessions, long considered the gold standard of evidence, becomes problematic when those confessions are obtained through techniques that exploit human vulnerability. It also raises broader questions about how society views caregivers, particularly young women in positions of responsibility. The expectation that they must always remain patient, nurturing, and composed ignores the reality of human stress and fatigue. By suggesting that a moment of frustration could explain the tragedy, the detectives tapped into a stereotype that made their narrative more convincing. Yet whether this stereotype reflected truth or convenience remains an open question. Over time, this interrogation has been studied by criminologists, psychologists, and legal scholars. They note the layering of tactics: minimization, rapport building, repetition, authority, fear of consequences, and appeals to conscience. They point out how these strategies, while legal, walk a fine line between persuasion and coercion. They emphasize that the absence of physical intimidation does not make an interrogation benign. Psychological pressure can be just as powerful, if not more so, in shaping outcomes. The daycare worker herself has continued to maintain her innocence, insisting that she never intended harm and that the confession was the product of fear and exhaustion. Supporters argue that her case exemplifies the dangers of relying too heavily on confessions without corroborating evidence. Critics contend that she alone had the opportunity to cause the fatal injury, and that her shifting accounts reveal consciousness of guilt. The divide reflects the broader tension in criminal justice between certainty and doubt, closure and truth. What remains indisputable is the tragedy at the heart of the case: the loss of a young child whose life ended far too soon. For his family, the grief is permanent, and the search for answers was always about more than legal outcomes. For the accused, the experience of interrogation and conviction has become a defining ordeal, one that reshaped the course of her life. For society, the case serves as a reminder of the profound responsibility that comes with investigating crimes, and the need for caution in accepting confessions at face value. As with many cases of disputed confessions, the truth may never be fully known. The events of that day exist in fragments of memory, in forensic reports, and in statements shaped by hours of psychological pressure. The child is gone, the caregiver imprisoned, and the community left with lingering questions. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is not about guilt or innocence, but about the fragility of truth in the crucible of interrogation. The story compels us to reflect on the balance between justice and fairness, between the pursuit of answers and the protection of rights. It challenges us to consider how far investigators should go in seeking the truth, and whether the methods they employ can sometimes obscure it instead. Above all, it underscores the human cost of every decision made in the shadow of tragedy, the cost borne by families, by the accused, and by the system itself. In the end, what began as an ordinary day at a daycare became a case that continues to echo in discussions of law, psychology, and ethics. It reminds us that behind every confession lies a complex interplay of memory, emotion, and suggestion. And it forces us to ask, with humility and unease, whether we can ever truly be certain of what happened in that small room on that fateful January afternoon.